This episode is available in audio format on all major platforms. February 2023, a gigantic object appears in the sky of Montana in the United States. Dozens of witnesses observe the scene while local media document the event. Photos in support, some speak of a UFO. Quickly, social networks ignite as information begins to filter as to the nature of the object in question. A few hours later, we learn that it is a huge spy balloon sent by China to secretly study the strategic military sites of the United States. The Pentagon confirms the news in a press conference. It is claimed that the balloon is part of an extensive Chinese spy program against countries around the world, and that this is far from the first time that such a thing has happened. China replies that this is completely false, that the device is a simple weather balloon having deviated from its trajectory, and that it is in fact the United States which spies with stratospheric balloons, adding that the American devices flew over China in the -10 times only 2022. The relationship between Beijing and Washington only crumbles dramatically as he settles. A climate of suspicion, of paranoia quite typical of the Cold War. The balloon spies and destroys with fighter jets. Severe penalties are imposed. The United States cancels an important meeting with China, and in just 3 days, 3 new objects are spotted and shot down by fighter plane over North America. Obviously, the episode attracts the attention of the whole world, while many experts are amazed as much by the audacity of the Chinese government as by the inaction of the American government. Today, we finally begin to connect the dots, to understand that huge lies have been served to the public in a way that hides key elements of the story that completely changes the narrative, both at the political strategic level. This documentary, I suggest you go back in detail on the famous history of the Chinese balloon to better understand what really happened in the flows. This is why the official version is so far from the truth. It is an absolutely fascinating tale of secret schemes, espionage, clandestine mission, and arms race between the great powers. Because many people first wondered about the Chinese balloon saga. That's of course why a balloon, after all. China operates hundreds of spy satellites capable of collecting extremely precise information. So why risk getting caught with such an obvious and easy to detect means of surveillance? Make it understood. It is worth going back quickly to the history of the balloons themselves because, of course, from the invention of the first balloons and airships, military strategists saw enormous potential in the technology at the time. The only way to get an idea of your enemy's position was to send the cavalry out to find them. Rising into the sky, it becomes possible to see the entire battlefield, offering a considerable advantage over the opponent. With the beginning of the First World War, the balloons become downright essential and know a real golden age equipped with cameras and telegraph and are perfect for photographing the trenches. Monitor movements, transmit messages too much, adjust artillery fire, or prevent enemy attacks. Obviously, the balloons are then extremely expensive and rudimentary, are vulnerable to the winds, difficult to steer, easy to spot, also crashes constantly. So, before the war even ends, the huge, clumsy balloons are replaced by new technology. Promises in itself to revolutionize warfare. The birth of aviation, balloons, and airships quickly fell into oblivion. In fact, it wasn't until World War II that new creative ways of using them were found. In 1942, the British launched Operation, which sent nearly 100,000 balloons towards Nazi territory. The Germans expend so much fuel trying to shoot down these balloons that the British continue, if only to exhaust German resources. Shortly after, the Japanese in turn developed a comparable but even bolder and much more sophisticated weapon. These benefits from winds that blow at high altitude. The Japanese send thousands of balloons over some 10,000 kilometers to drop incendiary bombs on the forests of the west coast of the United States. At least 300 balloons hit their target in what becomes the longest-range air attack in the history of the war. Immediately, the Americans are fascinated by technology, want to exploit this kind of method as much as possible in the face of what they consider to be their next geopolitical and civilizational adversary, the USSR, during the years that follow. Projects such as Mobility, Skyrock, Mockingbird, or Hindering Tricks deploys thousands of stratospheric balloons in order to spy on adversaries such as the USSR. In fact, We now know that a considerable number of reports of UFOs and extraterrestrials during the 1950 and 1960 were actually spy balloons, launching secretly from military bases in the Midwest. The problem is that balloons at high altitudes are still difficult to steer. They tend to crash into the ground without being able to collect the data, and almost every time that they ended up in the diplomatic scandal erupting with the country. And most importantly, aerospace technology is advancing at breakneck speed. The balloons are simply eclipsed by the arrival of satellites and spy planes such as YouTube, Nitrox or BlackBerry. In fact, it was only at the beginning of the 2000s that things began to move. With the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, as well as the fight against terrorism, the United States is spending absolutely huge sums on military research, in particular in order to constitute a global network of espionage and intelligence. After September 11, missile defense, mass surveillance and airspace protection became priority. The balloons are again being studied with the hope of making them detection and surveillance tools. The problem is still the same. Balloons are so big that they are basically bound to follow the direction of the wind unless you tie them up. Impossible to keep them above a fixed point, which considerably limits their potential this time. A quite brilliant solution eventually emerges. Instead of fighting the prevailing winds, why not do like the Japanese and take advantage of what you need to understand is that the stratosphere is itself composed of several layers, called strata, where the prevailing winds are relatively predictable depending on the altitude at which you are. What this theoretically means is that it is possible to literally steer a balloon simply by adjusting its altitude to take advantage of different wind directions inside different layers of Eureka. Thanks to this major discovery, we are witnessing a spectacular progression of technology, but also potential applications in a military context. Becomes possible to launch balloons and control them in the stratosphere so that it serves as a highly versatile platform for a whole multitude of comparatively satellite functions whose trajectory is predictable and difficult to modify. Balloons can move at any time and stay above their target for hours, providing vastly superior capabilities to drones and satellites. Even better, since balloons fly so high in the stratosphere, many radars have difficulty spotting them, allowing the balloon to operate with impunity, often without ever being detected. And since communication satellites would be as essential as they are vulnerable in the event of a major war, the Americans are also developing plans to replace traditional satellite networks with high-altitude balloons around 2010. The United States tests models of balloons able to fly for weeks from many countries, launches headlong into the race for the stratosphere in order to catch up with American progress in this number. How many on France, the United Kingdom, Israel, Russia, but also, of course, China? Beijing sees the balloon as a perfect way to compete with America at low cost in the aerospace sphere while adding an extra layer to its extensive intelligence and espionage network. Here, 2015, China conducts its first flights of stratospheric balloons. The progress is celebrated in the local media as a few weeks later, Xi Jinping announces the addition of a new branch to the structure of the Chinese military. After the land forces, the naval forces, the air forces, the space forces, we add the strategic support forces, a new military body responsible for everything related to cyberspace, electronic warfare, reconnaissance, intelligence and information warfare. In 2017, China is testing a model capable of releasing miniature drones from an altitude of 80,000 feet, and Americans are stunned by the progress of China, increasingly worried about being beaten in the weaponization of space. Definitely, we must react. Upon coming to power, new President Donald Trump's response to China is also to create an entirely new branch of the US Armed Forces, so as to better compete with Beijing. It is the famous Space Force. Washington then launched many secret programs to use the balloons for strategic purposes. The ALTA program seeks to predict high-altitude winds through artificial intelligence. The COSTARD program seeks to spy on and monitor enemies through stratospheric balloons. And finally, the Tripwires program seeks in particular to locate and destroy spy balloons. In 2019, strange white lights flies over the city of Kansas City, while dozens of witnesses are convinced of the presence of a UFO. A little later, We learned that the famous lights were in fact spy balloons developed by the American research agency in the DARPA Advanced Defense Project in the United States, announces that it has deployed 25 spy balloons to fly over major American cities and test new mass surveillance technologies. Also in 2009, the US military hatched a plan to employ stratospheric balloons as a mothership to release thousands of miniature drones and passive sensors directly into enemy territory. Even more, from 2020, a development little known to the general public has completely changed the game, as the Americans introduced through the Space Force a portable and highly secret weapon to jam enemy satellites. One-button control means Chinese spy satellites are essentially blind above many US targets. More than ever, China must accelerate the development of its 2000 balloon program. 19 to 2022 incidents involving unidentified balloons are becoming almost routine within the US military. The flights multiplied particularly around the coast of Hawaii, whereas the fighter planes are dispatched on several occasions to identify UFOs. In 2020, we learn of UFOs detected near Virginia were in fact military radar jamming balloons deployed by China. A balloon crashes off Hawaii in the summer of 2022. The United States examines the debris and confirms beyond any doubt that they are the target of a Chinese balloon spy program, stratospheric. These balloons are particularly capable of carrying out electromagnetic espionage or intelligence signals, allowing them to absorb waves of all kinds like a sponge. Within a certain radius, it is established that the effort is based on the island of Hainan and that they fall under a specialized unit of the Chinese Liberation Army. This information in hand, US intelligence is able to monitor each development of the program, is identified previous flights. We discover about 20 flights all over the world, including in the United States. If upon launch from Hainan Island, the newest Chinese balloon is tracked and observed by US intelligence for previous flights, they expect the balloon to head for Hawaii and Guam to spy on the strategic installations of the United States in the Pacific. After only a few days, US analysts are looking at it, deviated from its trajectory while sliding towards Alaska on January 28, when it became clear that the balloon was going to fly over American territory. An internal note and circulation warning of its imminent arrival. At this time, for some reason that escapes many, no particular response is triggered, and President Joe Biden is still not informed of the situation. In fact, it's only February 1, after the balloon clears Canadian airspace, returns to the United States and prepares to fly over the nuclear missiles. Positioned in Montana, the president flopped and finally informed of the incursion immediately. He ordered that he be presented with military options and that the balloon be shot down as quickly as possible. But the operation must remain absolutely secret. The population had to learn that the Chinese are flying spy balloons above the United States. It would be a diplomatic crisis. Guarantees the Americans are, on the contrary, trying to relax the relationship with China. In just a few days, Secretary of State Antony Blinken is due to meet with his counterpart. The first in more than 5 years, therefore. No way to spoil this meeting. YouTube spy planes are deployed to observe the device. The pilot then takes a selfie with the Chinese balloon, an image that quickly became famous within the Pentagon. Americans realize this is extremely serious. They are stunned by the audacity of the Chinese, but also completely confused to see that China is carrying out a spy operation too, obvious and poorly executed just 2 days from a major diplomatic meeting. Either it's provocation or it's incompetence. American diplomats are increasing furious appeals to their Chinese counterparts. The United States tells China that they know exactly what they have flown over when they demand that the balloon be removed from their airspace. Only to add to the confusion, the Chinese contact all seem to be in the dark, are as surprised as the Americans at the very existence of the spy operation. We learn later that Xi Jinping himself, the Chinese president, is informed of the blunder, only after the ball has entered the United States. As the Chinese plane prepares to fly over the sparsely populated mountains of Montana, the military believes this is the perfect opportunity to shoot it down. Berlin Airport is closed to air traffic during several witnesses observe military planes of all kinds. Tanker 22, a surveillance plane. Clearly, something is happening in the sky. as the fighter planes alternately climb in altitude in order to reach a strange object that many describe as a white light. In this first exit, the F-22 Americans are simply unable to reach the altitude of the balloon, so they fail and return to base. After this failure, Guide consults again with the military, who suggests that he wait until the balloon is over the ocean to use a missile. Again, things must be kept secret. The problem is that the ball is extremely difficult to hide. Many people witnessed the military operation, and some even participated within hours. The details of the operation begin to flow in the local media, as well as on social networks. Images in support. The image is impossible to deny. The White House is up against the wall. It is necessary to offer an official explanation in order to regain control of the narrative and live. A few hours later, the NBC channel announces exclusively through official sources that the American army is actively monitoring a Chinese spy balloon flying over the United States. Shortly after, the Pentagon confirms the news in a press conference, shedding light on a massive Chinese spy program, saying the US made a conscious decision not to kick the ball and let them continue its pursuit. Mission supposedly for security reasons. No mention of the failed operation to intercept, says the Pentagon and White House are worried about creating debris. Several sources immediately. Why not just evacuate a limited area? Why let the ball cross the United States, and especially if it's not the first time it's happened? Why inform the public only today? The reality is that the White House had every intention of keeping the whole story a secret, in order to, of course, protect relations with China, but also to avoid a very public humiliation of the American air defense. Joe Biden's advisors meet to think about a strategy. First, they agree that the meeting will have to be cancelled, but above all that it will be necessary to draw attention as much as possible to the role of China in order to regain control of the narrative. The next day, those close to the White House multiplied media outlets and controlled leaks, in short, in more than 40 countries on the question of the balloon, in order to rally support during all this time. The balloon is a real embarrassment for the Americans, as it flies slowly over countries in an almost nonchalant way, as if to taunt the United States. Only on February 4, after several days in American airspace, was the spy balloon finally shot down by a missile fired from a Type 22 fighter plane.
Frank 1, last one, COI 1. Copy, flash. That is a kill. The balloon is completely destroyed. Last one, COI 1. Copy, flash. That is a kill. The balloon is completely destroyed.
Once the spy balloon finally beat, the United States come out of the episode, completely stunned, confused, frustrated. The credibility of the United States military and the United States military in air defense is seriously in doubt after the September 11 disaster. It is absolutely shocking how easily an adversary can enter US airspace without authorization. In the following days, the United States adjusts its radar systems to ensure that there are no other balloons, and suddenly they send everywhere. In 3 days, 3 new unidentified flying objects were shot down by fighter planes in a reaction as hysterical as it was political. February 10 in Alaska, 11 in the Canadian North, and 12 near the Great Lakes. Everything indicates that they are simple weather balloons. It will later be learned that at least one of these objects was in fact a simple Pico-type amateur balloon belonging to the Northern Illinois Plug Balloon Brigade. So here's a $250 million stealth fighter jet firing a 500,000 homing missile to shoot down a $12 Picket balloon. Several lessons can be learned from the episode. Fascinating Chinese balloon first. It allows us to see the full extent of what is hidden from the public in terms of intelligence, espionage, but also relations between the great powers. It shows how bad communication is between Beijing, Washington's, how much a simple balloon that has deviated from its trajectory can create a diplomatic and military incident is even worse. It demonstrates in an explicit and terrifying way how bad communication is inside China itself. Not only did the intelligence services peglet a spy operation just days before a sensitive meeting with an American dignitary, but even more so, it seems that they never shared the information with their colleagues in the diplomatic corps, and Xi Jinping himself is among the last to hear the news. It's such a grotesque, embarrassing lack of coordination that almost seems deliberate. For some, it is quite possible that the incursion of the Chinese balloon is the voluntary work of a political faction opposed to the attempt at approachment with the United States. One thing is certain. If the objective was to sabotage the detente between the two powers, well, one can say, mission accomplished. While relations between Beijing and Washington once again take on Cold War hours with all the paranoia, suspicion, and hysteria that comes with it, dear friends, it is an immense pleasure to work on files of this kind.